So welcome to this annotated anatomy video that's going to look at the branches of the celiac trunk and how they supply the organs of the foregut. So before we look at these branches, we need to be aware of the organs that reside in the foregut. So this is namely going to be the stomach, which would draw out here and is then continuous with the duodenum. So here we have the duodenum, we have the esophagus entering into the stomach, we have the fundus up here. This long curvature is known as the greater curvature of the stomach, and that's mirrored by a smaller one, which is the lesser curvature. We then have the main body of the stomach, which tapers down to the pylorus, which then forms the pyloric sphincter, which we can see here. Then you have the duodenum continuing. Over to the left-hand side of the stomach, in the left-hand aspect of the abdomen, in the left hypochondriac region, we have the spleen. So here's the spleen. And then over on the opposite side, in the right hypochondriac, and sometimes extending to the epigastrium, we have the liver. So obviously I'm not drawing these organs in their precise anatomical location or their kind of relative size to one another. That wouldn't really be appropriate for this video, but we get the general impression of where these organs are positioned. I'll just draw the gallbladder underneath the liver here as well. So here's the gallbladder, and then we have the liver, and over here we have the spleen. So all of these organs that reside within the foregut are going to be supplied from the celiac trunk. The celiac trunk is one of those three unpaired arteries that come off the abdominal aorta, and the celiac trunk is a short artery that gives rise to three branches relatively quickly once it's emerged from the aorta. So here we have the celiac trunk. It leaves approximately from T12 and it gives off those three branches. So let's detail those three branches. Firstly, let's look at the left gastric artery. That travels towards the lesser curvature of the stomach. It gives off a smallish branch that goes up towards the esophagus. But most of the left gastric artery is going to be running down this lesser curvature of the stomach. So the left gastric, a branch of the celiac trunk, is supplying this lesser curvature of the stomach. If we then move on to the splenic artery, as its name suggests, the splenic artery is going to supply the spleen, and this artery runs posterior to the stomach. So I'll draw it going behind the stomach with these dotted lines, running posterior to the stomach, and then once it emerges from behind the stomach, it extends up towards the spleen, where it then gives off numerous branches to give arterial blood to the spleen. As the splenic artery arrives at the spleen, before it enters the hilum, it gives off a series of short gastric arteries. And these short gastric arteries are responsible for supplying the fundus and the posterior aspect of the stomach. So splenic artery supplies the spleen. Before it reaches the spleen, it gives off the short gastric arteries. It also gives off a long, slender artery that runs along the greater curvature of the stomach, and this is known as the left gastroepiploic artery. So here we have the left gastroepiploic artery. Sometimes you'll hear it called the gastroamental artery. Doesn't make a massive difference, whatever you want to call it. Here we've got the left gastroepiploic artery, and that's supplying this greater curvature. So coming from the celiac trunk, we've seen the left gastric supplying the lesser curvature, and here we've got the splenic that travels behind the stomach and goes towards the spleen. Before it gets to the spleen, it gives off a series of short gastric arteries, and also the left gastroepiploic that runs down the greater curvature. So finally, coming off the celiac trunk, we're going to look at this third branch, which is the common hepatic artery. The common hepatic artery divides quite quickly into the hepatic artery proper that extends towards the liver. This artery then itself divides into a left hepatic and a right hepatic. The right hepatic artery being important in that it gives off a branch to the gallbladder, and this is known as the cystic artery. So the common hepatic artery actually splits into two arteries. We have the hepatic artery proper and that is formed once the common hepatic artery has given off the gastroduodenal artery. So here we can see the gastroduodenal artery. Common hepatic coming from the celiac trunk, it then splits into the hepatic artery proper and the gastroduodenal artery. I'll come back to the gastroduodenal artery in a moment. Also coming off the hepatic artery proper, we've seen it's giving off the left and right hepatic, is the sister to the left gastric, and this artery is known as the right gastric artery. And the right gastric artery again is going to run towards the lesser curvature of the stomach. So here we can see the left gastric and the right gastric come together on the lesser curvature of the stomach, and they form an anastomosis in this region. So the lesser curvature is supplied by the left gastric and also by the right gastric here. If we return now to the gastroduodenal artery, the gastroduodenal artery passes posterior to the right gastric, and it continues posterior towards the duodenum. Before it passes under the duodenum, it gives off the supraduodenal artery. That obviously supplies the superior aspect of the duodenum. And then once it's passed underneath the duodenum, it also splits into two. It splits into a significant branch that also runs around the greater curvature, and this is known as your right gastroepiploic artery. And this artery is going to go and anastomose with the left gastroepiploic artery. So here's our right gastroepiploic artery. Also coming off the gastroduodenal and going towards the pancreas and the duodenum is the superior pancreatico-duodenal artery, and that's running to both the duodenum and the pancreas. This artery itself can also split into anterior and posterior parts. So here we see the celiac trunk and how it supplies the organs of the foregut, the spleen, stomach, liver, parts of the duodenum and parts of the pancreas. Celiac trunk gives off three main branches: the left gastric, the splenic and the common hepatic. These then themselves give off subsequent branches that help to supply these organs.